Jedediah lay pinned under a shattered oak timber, the freezing sludge of vein 19 filling his lungs as the mountain groaned in a final, rhythmic thrum. Through the flickering amber light of a dying headlamp, he stared into the face of the woman he had buried 10 years ago. She didn't speak. She only pointed a soot-stained finger toward a cage of jagged quartz where their son, Caleb, was being slowly fused into the coal wall. The entity wore his wife's wedding ring and her hollowed-out eyes, whispering a debt that could only be paid in Kramer blood. As the ceiling began to buckle, and the heartbeat of the mine rose to a deafening roar, Jedediah realized the journal he'd found wasn't a map to a fortune. It was a ledger of souls. He had 6 inches of movement and a rusted pickaxe to stop the mountain from swallowing his son. But as the woman's face began to peel away into black smoke, he had to ask, if he struck the killing blow, would he be saving his family or finally finishing the ritual? Oh, the sludge clung to Jedediah's gloves like wet cement, each movement dragging the weight of it deeper into the seams of his jacket. The air in vent shaft 4 tasted of rust and something sharper, chemical maybe, or just the slow rot of metal giving up. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, fogging the inside of his mask before vanishing into the dim glow of his headlamp. He was knee-deep in the freezing, thick slurry that collected at the bottom of the forbidden shaft, a place where the mining company's industrial waste bled into the mountain's natural veins. Every step required a deliberate yank of his hip, the suction of the mud trying to claim his boots as part of the geography. He wasn't supposed to be here. The company had sealed this sector decades ago, citing unstable geological conditions. But Jedediah knew better. The mountain wasn't unstable. It was hungry. He waded deeper, the beam of his lamp cutting through the hanging mist to find the prize. A specific, fat copper valve located at the primary seal of the tunnel. It was a heavy piece of pre-war brass, pure and dense, the kind of scrap that would fetch enough at the yard to keep the creditors from seizing Caleb's truck. That truck was more than a vehicle. It was his son's only ticket out of this dying holler, a way to cross the state line before the dust turned the boy's lungs to stone like it had everyone else's. The valve loomed ahead, a tarnished copper vein pulsing in the dark. He wedged the heavy iron wrench into the seam where the metal met the wall, his fingers numb from the cold that seeped through his industrial gloves. The first twist sent a shudder through the pipe, a groan that echoed like a dying animal deep in the rock. Jedediah gritted his teeth and leaned in, his boots slipping in the muck as he threw his entire weight against the tool. The wrench bit deep into the soft copper, and for a second, the mountain seemed to lean in with him. The silence of the shaft replaced by the low-frequency vibration of shifting tectonic plates. It was a warning, a rumble that vibrated in his teeth. But Jedediah ignored the structural instability. He couldn't afford to be afraid of a collapse when the alternative was watching his son walk to the mines on Monday morning. He shifted his grip, palms slick with grime, and heaved. The metal groaned, a high-pitched shriek of protesting brass that cut through the stagnant air. With a sharp metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot in the confined space, the valve snapped free. Watery sludge gushed from the gap, splattering his chest and face. But Jedediah didn't flinch. He caught the heavy piece before it could vanish into the muck. As the flow of waste subsided into a rhythmic drip, a new sound emerged from the dark abyss below the shaft. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of stone. It was a rhythmic, metallic thrumming, a pulse so deep it felt like it was coming from the center of the earth. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a massive, mechanical heartbeat, echoing through the iron walls of the ventilation system. Jedediah froze, the heavy valve clutched to his chest, his own heart racing to match the subterranean cadence. The vibration traveled up through the soles of his boots, a steady, driving force that felt ancient and deliberate. The thrumming grew louder, a physical weight in the air that made the hair on his arms stand up. Then came the voice. It wasn't a shout, but a whisper, thin and dry like dead leaves skittering across a grave. Jedediah. The sound seemed to come from the very dark he was staring into, a formless call that knew his name. He remained paralyzed, his headlamp flickering as if the air itself were draining the battery. Terror, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He had spent 50 years in these mountains, heard every trick the wind could play in a tunnel. But this was different. This was a summons. He squeezed the copper valve until the edges bit into his palms, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice didn't repeat itself, but the echo lingered, a ghost of a sound that made the forbidden shaft feel like a throat. And he was nothing more than a morsel halfway down. He forced himself to move, his eyes darting across the muck as he prepared to scramble back toward the surface. The light caught on something that wasn't stone or sludge. Wedged into the rusted metal grate near the floor was a small, rectangular object. He reached down, his fingers trembling, and pulled it free. It was a journal. The leather cover soot-stained and cracked, the edges of the pages swollen with moisture but still intact. It felt strangely warm in his hand, a piece of something human in this mechanical grave. He didn't stop to examine it, tucking it securely into the inner pocket of his heavy denim jacket, right against his ribs. The weight of the copper and the book felt like a burden and a shield all at once. He turned, his boots splashing through the sludge as he scrambled toward the exit, the heartbeat still thudding in the rock behind him. Light broke through the end of the tunnel, but it brought no relief. Standing at the mouth of the ventilation shaft was a silhouette he knew too well. Miller was a broad-shouldered man who moved with the slow, predatory grace of a wolf that had never missed a meal. Behind him stood two younger men, thugs with vacant eyes and heavy hands, their jackets stained with the grease of the town's only functioning garage. Miller didn't smile. He just watched Jedediah emerge from the dark, his watery blue eyes tracking the bulge of the copper valve in Jedediah's pack. "You're a hard man to find, Jed," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that carried over the wind. "Especially when you owe people money. People who don't like waiting. People who think you're trying to hide from your responsibilities in a hole in the ground." Jedediah stopped 10 feet away, the mud of the shaft still dripping from his sleeves. He looked at the two thugs, then back to Miller. "I told you I'd have the money by Friday, Miller. I'm working on it." Miller stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Friday was yesterday, Jed. Today is the day we start taking things. And I think we'll start with that truck of Caleb's. It's the only thing you own that's worth the grease it takes to run it. Unless, of course, you've got something in that bag that changes the math." Jedediah felt a surge of heat in his chest, a protective fury that burned through the chill of the shaft. "You touch that truck, and I'll kill you, Miller. That's the boy's life you're talking about." Miller's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold. "His life is a debt, Jed, just like yours. And it's time to collect." The air between them turned brittle. One of the thugs shifted, his hand drifting toward a lead pipe tucked into his waistband. Jedediah knew there was no talking his way out of this. Miller didn't want the scrap. He wanted the leverage. The fight erupted without a word. The first thug lunged, swinging a heavy fist that Jedediah dodged by a hair's breadth. The mud underfoot was slick, turning the clearing into a treacherous arena. Jedediah swung his heavy pack, the copper valve inside acting like a mace, catching the second thug in the ribs with a sickening crunch. but he was old, and they were many. A blow caught him in the side of the head, sending sparks dancing across his vision. He went down on one knee, the freezing slush soaking into his trousers, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he tasted blood in his mouth. Miller stepped in, looking down at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He reached for the pack, but Jedediah's hand shot out, grabbing the heavy iron wrench from his belt. With a guttural roar, he swung the tool in a wide arc. The metal caught Miller across the shins, a brutal strike that sent the debt collector crashing into the freezing slush. The two thugs hesitated, surprised by the older man's ferocity. Jedediah didn't give them a second chance. He scrambled to his feet, swinging the wrench like a madman, forcing them back just enough to find a gap in their circle. He didn't look back to see if Miller was getting up. He just ran, his heart hammering against his ribs in time with that phantom heartbeat he'd heard in the dark. He tore through the underbrush, the branches clawing at his face and clothes. He knew the shortcuts through the hills, the places where the ground was too unstable for men who didn't spend their lives looking at the dirt. He could hear them shouting behind him, the heavy thud of boots on the trail. But he didn't slow down. He moved through the rugged terrain with a desperate, lung-burning speed, his vision blurring as the adrenaline began to ebb. He crossed the rusted rail line and ducked into the shadow of the old wash plant, weaving through the skeletal remains of the conveyor belts until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. He was battered. His eye was beginning to swell shut, and his hands were shaking. But he still had the valve. And he still had the book. The house sat on the edge of the holler, a sagging clapboard structure that looked like it was being slowly reclaimed by the forest. Jedediah burst through the door and threw the heavy bolt, leaning his forehead against the wood as he fought for air. The silence of the house was a relief, though it felt heavy, as if the walls were leaning in to hear him breathe. He moved to the kitchen table and slumped into a chair, the copper valve hitting the wood with a dull thud. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the journal. It was damp, the soot smudging his fingers as he carefully pried the cover open. He needed to know what was worth hiding in a ventilation shaft, what secret the mountain had tried to whisper to him in the dark. He turned the first page, and the world seemed to tilt. The handwriting wasn't the jagged, masculine scrawl of his grandfather, the man who had supposedly built the shaft. It was a delicate, flowing script he hadn't seen in 20 years. It belonged to his wife, Sarah. His breath hitched as he read the first entry, dated 3 weeks after the night she had vanished. She hadn't fled to the city. She had been here, in the holler, watching the mine. The text described the same rhythmic heartbeat he had heard earlier, a pulse of the earth that she claimed was calling to her. Jedediah's hands shook so violently, the pages rattled. He had spent 2 decades believing she had abandoned them, but the journal told a story of a woman haunted by the very thing he had just touched. The mountain hadn't just taken her, it had kept her. The revelation was a physical blow, leaving him hollowed out in the dim light of the kitchen. He stared at the copper valve, then back at the book, the realization dawning on him that his life was a lie, built on the silence of the stone. But there was no time for grief. A low subterranean roar suddenly tore through the quiet of the morning, a sound like a freight train passing directly beneath the floorboards. The house shuddered, the windows rattling in their frames as a massive sinkhole opened in the garden, swallowing the row of withered corn and the old stone well in a single, hungry gulp. The earth was opening up, the foundation of the house groaning as the soil shifted toward the new void. Jedediah scrambled for the door, the primal instinct for survival overriding the shock of the journal. The mountain wasn't just whispering anymore. It was starting to eat. He stood on the porch, watching the dust settle over the jagged hole where his garden used to be. The fence was gone, the gate hanging over the abyss by a single rusted hinge. Before he could process the destruction, a black sedan pulled up the gravel drive, stopping just short of the new crater. Sheriff Thompson climbed out, his movements slow and stiff, his face a mask of weary resignation. He didn't look at the sinkhole. He looked at Jedediah. He walked up the steps and pinned a bright yellow final eviction notice to the front door, right over the crack in the wood. 6 hours, Jed, Thompson said, his voice avoiding Jedediah's eyes. The company's declared this whole sector a total loss. Geological instability. They're condemning everything from here to the wash plant. You need to be out by sunset. You can't do this, Thompson. Jedediah rasped, his voice cracking. This is my land. My father's land. Thompson finally looked up, and Jedediah saw the hollowed-out fear in the lawman's eyes. It's not your land anymore, Jed. The company bought the mineral rights 100 years ago, and that contract includes the surface if the integrity of the extraction is compromised. Look at your yard. There is no integrity left. He turned back to his car, his limp more pronounced than usual. 6 hours. Don't make me come back with the state boys. They won't be as polite. Jedediah watched him drive away, the yellow paper fluttering in the wind like a funeral shroud. He had 6 hours to save a lifetime of memories, and nowhere to take them. Desperation drove him toward the town center. He needed to find the land agent, to show him the deed his father had kept in the safe, to prove that the company's claim was a fraud. He reached the mining company's land office, a squat brick building that had once been the most imposing structure in the holler. But as he pushed through the door, he found only ghosts. The lobby was stripped bare, the desks gone, the filing cabinets standing open and empty like rib cages. The air smelled of ozone and scorched paper. Someone had been through here with a shredder and a match. There were no records, no contracts, no proof of anything. The company hadn't just left. They had erased themselves, leaving the people of Blackwood Holler to be swallowed by the holes they had dug. He stood in the center of the empty room, the silence echoing the hollow feeling in his gut. He returned to the house, his mind a static-filled mess of grief and panic. As he stepped onto the porch, a sudden thud against the kitchen window made him jump. A small mountain sparrow lay on the glass ledge, its neck broken, its wings twitching in the final throes of death. When Jedediah picked it up, his fingers came away black. The bird wasn't covered in dirt. It was coated in a fine, greasy layer of coal dust, as if it had flown through a cloud of soot so thick it had choked the life out of it. He looked up at the sky, but the air was clear. The dust was coming from within, a sickness rising from the earth itself. He dropped the bird, his skin crawling. The omens were piling up, a language of disaster he was only beginning to translate. At the door, Caleb's dog, a scruffy mutt that usually never left the boy's side, was whimpering. The animal refused to cross the threshold, its hackles raised, its tail tucked tight between its legs. It scratched at the porch boards, a high-pitched, keening sound coming from its throat. Jedediah tried to whistle for it, but the dog just backed away, its eyes fixed on the floor of the house as if it could see something moving beneath the wood. The thrumming was back, louder now, a rhythmic vibration that made the china in the cupboard rattle. It wasn't just a sound, it was an invitation. The dog knew it. The bird knew it. And as Jedediah looked at the soot on his fingers, he realized he knew it too. The sound of a truck engine cutting out in the driveway snapped him back to the present. He expected Caleb, but the man who stepped out of the vehicle was holding a shotgun. Miller had returned, his face bruised and his eyes burning with a cold, focused rage. He didn't stay by the car this time. He marched toward the porch, the weapon leveled at Jedediah's chest. "You stole something more than copper, Jed," Miller hissed, his voice trembling with a strange, frantic energy. "The company's looking for the debt record, the ledger from the shaft. You give it to me now, or I'll blow a hole in you and find it myself." Jedediah realized with a jolt that they weren't talking about money anymore. The journal in his pocket, it wasn't just a diary. It was the record of the town's soul, the proof of the bargain that had built this place. "I don't have your record, Miller," Jedediah shouted, backing toward the side of the house. Miller didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, the blast shattering the porch railing and sending a spray of splinters into the air. Jedediah dove off the side of the porch, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the shadows of the tree line. He didn't look back to see Miller reloading. He ran toward the coal wash plant, the massive, rusted structure looming like a cathedral of iron in the distance. It was a labyrinth of conveyor belts and chutes, the only place he knew well enough to lose a man with a gun. He could hear Miller and his thugs crashing through the brush behind him, their shouts echoing off the hills. He burst into the wash plant, his boots echoing on the metal catwalks. The interior was a forest of rusted machinery, the air thick with the smell of old grease and stagnant water. He climbed higher, his lungs burning, his bad eye weeping from the strain. He could see the flashlights of the search party below, sweeping the shadows like searching fingers. He reached the top of the primary sorter, a height of 50 feet, the ground below a blur of jagged metal and coal heaps. There was no way down but the way he came, unless he took the refuse chute. It was a steep, narrow slide of corrugated iron designed to dump waste into the settling pond. It was a suicide mission, but Miller's boots were already clanging on the ladder behind him. Jedediah didn't think. He jumped. He hit the metal slide with a bone-jarring impact and began to accelerate, the world turning into a blur of rusted orange and gray. The edges of the chute were jagged, tearing at his jacket and skin as he spiraled downward. A blast from Miller's shotgun echoed through the plant, the pellets pinging off the metal inches from his head. He hit a bend in the chute and was launched into the air, landing in a pile of soft, damp coal dust at the bottom. He lay there for a moment, the world spinning, his body a map of pain. He had escaped the blast, but he was broken. He looked down and realized his boots had been torn away in the descent, his feet bare and bleeding in the grit. But he reached into his jacket and felt the journal. It was still there. He dragged himself into a rusted equipment shed near the edge of the settling pond, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He needed to rest, to think. But the mountain wouldn't let him. He pulled the journal out, his fingers fumbling with the damp pages. As he reached the back cover, he felt a lump in the leather. He pried it open with his thumbnail and found a folded piece of vellum, a map drawn in the same delicate hand as the rest of the book. It wasn't a map of the coal seams. It was a map of the shadows. It showed the mine shafts not as industrial tunnels, but as a circulatory system. And at the center, marked in dark, heavy ink, was Vein 99. It wasn't a deposit of fuel. It was a ritual site, a place where the mountain's hunger had been fed for a century. The realization hit him like a physical weight. The investors who had founded Blackwood Holler weren't businessmen. They were occultists, men who had found a way to trade human misery for industrial power. And the Kramers, his family, were the currency. The map was covered in symbols he didn't recognize, but the meaning was clear. The mountain didn't want coal. It wanted the blood of the people who dug it. The debt Miller kept talking about wasn't financial. It was a blood pact, and it was coming due. He looked at his bare, bleeding feet and the soot on his hands. He was the last of the line, the final payment. unless he could find a way to offer something else. He knew he couldn't run anymore. The sinkholes, the birds, the dog. It was all a tightening noose. He had to go into the mine, to the heart of the sickness, and find a way to break the cycle. He used a strip of his shirt to bind his feet, the fabric quickly turning black with coal dust. He had a plan, a desperate, half-mad idea born of the journal's warnings. He would enter Vein 99 and offer a surrogate payment, a way to satisfy the mountain's hunger without losing Caleb. It was a gamble, a fool's errand, but it was all he had left. He stood up, the equipment shed groaning in the wind, and began the long trek back toward the mine's main entrance. The walk was a nightmare of pain and shadow. By the time he reached the house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the scarred landscape. He called out for Caleb, but the house remained silent. He pushed through the shattered front door, his heart sinking. The living room was a wreck, the furniture overturned, the air smelling of that same greasy coal dust. He ran to Caleb's bedroom and stopped dead. The bed was empty, the covers torn away, as if someone had dragged the boy out by force. On the floor, leading from the bed to the open window, was a trail of thick, oily black footprints. They weren't human. They were too long, the toes ending in sharp, jagged points. "Caleb!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the empty house. He ran to the window and looked out. The trail of sludge continued across the yard, cutting a dark path through the dead grass and leading straight into the yawning maw of the mine. The mountain had taken him. The debt had been called, and the mountain hadn't waited for Jedediah to make his offer. He felt a cold, dead weight settle in his stomach. He grabbed his old pickaxe from the porch and a bag of emergency flares, his movements mechanical and hollow. He didn't care about the eviction, or Miller, or his own life anymore. There was only the dark and the boy at the end of it. He entered the mine. The transition from the twilight to the absolute blackness of the tunnels felt like stepping into another world. The air was colder here, heavy with the scent of wet stone and ancient decay. He followed the trail of oily sludge, his headlamp cutting a weak path through the gloom. He reached the primary ventilation fan, a massive, rusted wheel that had been silent for years. Snagged on one of the jagged blades was a piece of fabric, a scrap of denim from Caleb's jacket. He touched it, the fabric still warm from the boy's body. Caleb was still alive, still breathing, but he was being pulled deeper into the lower levels, toward the places where the light never reached. He pushed forward, the tunnels narrowing as he descended into the forbidden sectors. He reached the entrance to Vein 99, a jagged hole in the rock that looked more like a wound than a doorway. He ignited a flare, the brilliant red light casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The mountain began to vibrate, a deafening rhythmic roar that matched the heartbeat from the journal. The sound was so loud, it felt like it was trying to shake his teeth from his gums. The structural integrity of the tunnel was failing, the timbers groaning and snapping like dried twigs under the pressure of the shifting earth. He struggled to stay on his feet, the floor pitching and rolling like the deck of a ship in a storm. Suddenly, the shadows began to move. Out of the darkness emerged a group of figures, their bodies tall and gaunt, their skin the color of soot. They were the Shadow Men, the animated, soot-caked corpses of the miners who had died in the 1920 collapse. Their eyes were empty sockets filled with a dim, flickering light, and their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. They blocked his path, their long, blackened fingers reaching for him. They didn't speak, but a chorus of whispers rose from their throats, a sound like static on a dead radio. They were the mountain's guardians, the physical manifestation of the debt that could never be paid. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He swung the rusted pickaxe with a desperate, frantic strength, the metal biting into the soot-stained flesh of the first Shadow Man. The creature didn't bleed. It just crumbled into a cloud of coal dust, only to begin reforming moments later. His headlamp flickered and dimmed, the battery dying at the worst possible moment. He was fighting in a world of red flare light and encroaching blackness, the toxic dust filling his lungs and making every breath a struggle. He was surrounded, the creatures pulling at his clothes and skin, their touch as cold as ice. He felt their jagged fingernails tear into his arms, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He fought through the circle of undead miners, his body a blur of motion and pain. He narrowly escaped their grasp, diving through a narrow crawl space that led toward the source of the mechanical pulsing. He emerged into a vast, central chamber, and the sight that met him stole the breath from his lungs. The room was filled with glowing, coal-veined quartz, the crystals pulsing with a sickly greenish light. In the center of the chamber was a massive cage of the same stone, and inside, suspended in a web of energy, was Caleb. The boy was pale, his eyes closed, his skin translucent. The quartz was siphoning his life force, the energy flowing from his body and into the mountain's heart. "Caleb!" Jedediah cried, rushing toward the cage. But a figure stepped out of the shadows, stopping him in his tracks. It was a woman, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft and beautiful, wearing the exact half-smile that had haunted his dreams for 20 years. It was Sarah. But as she stepped into the light, Jedediah saw the truth. Her eyes were black pits, and her joints bent at impossible angles. It was the entity, the thing that lived in the mountain, wearing his wife's face like a mask. It moved toward him with a slow, predatory grace, its voice a perfect mimicry of the woman he had loved. "He's beautiful, isn't he, Jedediah?" the entity whispered, the sound echoing in his mind. "The perfect payment? The last of the line. With his life, the mountain will be satisfied for another century. The holler will thrive, the coal will flow, and the debt will be settled. All you have to do is let go." Jedediah stared at the thing wearing his wife's skin, a mixture of grief and horror threatening to break him. "You're not her," he rasped, his hand tightening on the pickaxe. "She's gone. You took her, and now you're trying to take my son. I won't let you." The entity laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "I didn't take her, Jedediah. She gave herself to me. She saw the truth, that the mountain is the only thing that's real in this valley. And now, you will see it too." A massive tremor struck the chamber, the ground heaving with a violent force. A heavy structural timber, thick as a man's torso, snapped and fell from the ceiling. It caught Jedediah across the legs, pinning him to the stone floor with a sickening crunch of bone. He screamed, the pain white and blinding, as he watched the quartz cage begin to glow even brighter. The ceiling above was buckling, massive slabs of rock beginning to tear free from the mountain's weight. He lay there, trapped and bleeding, staring into the cold, obsidian eyes of the horror that wore his wife's face. He could feel his life draining away, the cold of the mine seeping into his marrow. Above him, the stone was cracking. The sound of the mountain's collapse, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. He was going to die here, and Caleb was going to be consumed, and the cycle of blood and hunger would continue forever. He looked at his son, his beautiful, brave boy, and a final, desperate clarity took hold of him. He wasn't just a miner. He was a foreman. He knew how the mountain worked. and he knew how to break it. His headlamp flickered one last time and died, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. The red flare had burned out, and the only light came from the sickly pulse of the quartz cage. The entity loomed over him, a shadow within the shadow, its presence a chilling weight on his chest. Jedediah remained paralyzed in the void, the pain in his legs a distant, throbbing thing. He closed his eyes and listened. He didn't listen to the entity's whispers or the roar of the collapse. He listened to the rock. He analyzed the shifting sounds, the way the pressure was moving through the squeeze points of the cavern. He identified the resonant frequency of the mountain's own heartbeat. He reached out and found his rusted pickaxe, his fingers closing around the cold metal. He couldn't move his legs, but he could still swing his arms. He began to strike a series of calculated, rhythmic blows against the specific structural support beam that was holding up the most unstable part of the ceiling. Each strike was timed to match the frequency of the mountain's pulse, a deliberate attempt to weaponize the immense weight above them. Clang, clang, clang. The sound vibrated through the rock, the vibrations amplifying the mechanical heartbeat until the very air seemed to shatter. The acoustic pressure grew to an unbearable intensity, and with a sound like 1,000 mirrors breaking at once, the quartz cage holding Caleb shattered. The fragments flew in every direction, the greenish light vanishing as the siphoning process was violently interrupted. Caleb fell to the floor, gasping for air, his eyes fluttering open. The entity shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage that shook the chamber to its foundations. It lunged toward Caleb, but the mountain was already reacting to Jedediah's strikes. The ceiling began to disintegrate in a rain of shale and dust. With a final, agonizing burst of adrenaline, Jedediah grabbed the edge of the fallen timber and heaved. He dragged his mangled legs across the stone floor, the pain a secondary thing to the sight of his son. He reached Caleb and pulled him close, shielding the boy's body with his own as the mountain began to implode. He saw a narrow, slick drainage flume at the edge of the chamber, an old escape route he'd mapped years ago. He shoved Caleb toward it, his voice a guttural rasp. "Go, Caleb! Run! Don't look back!" The entity was almost upon them, its blackened fingers reaching for the boy, but Jedediah swung the pickaxe one last time, striking the final support that held the chamber's mouth open. A massive slab of shale tore free from the ceiling, falling between them and the entity. Jedediah used the momentum of the rock to slide Caleb down the steep, slick flume, the boy disappearing into the dark toward the distant surface light. Jedediah stayed behind, his body a physical barrier against the darkness. He watched the mountain collapse, 1,000,000 tons of rock falling in a slow, graceful cascade that buried the ritual chamber and the entity beneath it. The ancient evil was trapped, the debt canceled by the destruction of the very place where it had been born. Jedediah felt the weight of the mountain settle over him, but he didn't feel fear. He felt peace. The mechanical thrumming fell silent, replaced by a deep, eternal quiet. Jedediah accepted his role as the new guardian, the man who had stayed behind to make sure the door stayed shut. He was the last Kramer, the one who had finally paid the debt in full. He closed his eyes and saw Sarah, not the monster, but the woman, her hand reaching out for him in the light. He took it, and the mountain became his home. On the surface, Caleb crawled out of the mine entrance, the morning sun blindingly bright. He watched the mountain peak subside and go still, the silence of the holler a testament to his father's sacrifice. He stood alone, the soot-stained journal clutched to his chest, and began to walk away from the ruins of Blackwood Holler. He was the last Kramer to touch the dust, and for the first time in 100 years, the mountain was just a mountain.